Okay, I hope I'm not oversimplifying this too much. Right, we're going down to the simple explanations, the simplest cases, and I'm hoping that you can make that expansion of if we can make a machine do it once, we can make a machine do it a million times. That's just a matter of repetition, because that's going to be a big one on today's thing. Thus far, everything we've looked at is real time, basically. We send in some sort of input, stuff happens, whichever example we're referring to, and we get back an output. Right? And we send in some sort of input, and our output at that same instance depends on that input that we've just sent in. Works for a lot of stuff. But one of the key points that separates computers from the rest of our machines is memory. Computers can remember what we sent in a little while ago. So it doesn't have to be real time. We can send in some inputs, do a bunch of other stuff, then come back and get the output that corresponds to those inputs. So computers can remember what was already done. That's kind of what separates them from our other machines that are just all acting in real time and can only give a real-time output for that real-time input. Computers can remember the earlier inputs. And I started with that point of expanding this up because obviously for the example, we're going to talk about one bit of memory. And one bit of memory isn't much to, we ain't going to do much with one bit of memory. But hopefully you can take that and expand it, right? It should be a simple concept there. If we can make a machine do it once, then we can just repeat it and make the machine do it a million times by repeating the same thing. So that's kind of a key point, and a very key point in computers is computers are the machines that can remember, that have memory, and that's an important part. So today let's look at how memory works in the machine. So the main tool we'll need to get memory out of a machine is something you probably didn't even realize was in your tool bag. I'm going to assume everybody is familiar with audio feedback. In my original plan, I actually grabbed the guitar, get some feedback to start this scene, but then upon review, I was like, maybe on the next take, I'll just refer to audio feedback and assume everybody in the modern society has encountered audio feedback at some point in their life. So somebody, let's say a singer, that's probably where you may have encountered it, a singer or speaker or something. Person sings, their voice goes into the microphone. Goes down the line, gets amplified, and comes out louder. Well, then if things are positioned correctly, or incorrectly in most cases, that sound's going to go back into the microphone. It's going to go down the line, get amplified, come out louder. Go back in the microphone, get amplified, come out louder, and before long we just have this annoying audio feedback filling the room. Usually an annoyance, but in some cases, the first two that always spring to my mind would be Jimi Hendrix and Tom Morello. And for them, feedback was just another note that their guitar played. They learned to control the feedback, and then it was just another note that would come out of their guitar. And that's what we need to do. When we control the feedback, it's just another tool we have to use. And that's very, very common in both electrical engineering and computer programming. In computer programming, we refer to it as recursion. And in electrical things, we refer to it just as feedback. And that's kind of what we need to do. I should let this picture up here. So everything so far in these videos, which are not being made in order. So when I say everything so far, that has some stuff before this and some stuff after this in the playlist. depending on where this one goes in the playlist, but they're not being made in order, so some stuff before this and some stuff after it. It's just the real time, just simple applied examples, where a current input leads to the current output. Well, when we add feedback, we're going to take this output, bring it back over, and set it as an input. So like in this case, I guess it's kind of like a simple NOT gate. We send in a 1, we get back a 0. Well then, now that 0, through feedback, that 0's our input. We don't have a 1 here, we have a 0. Which means our output is going to be a 1. Well, that's going to feed back. So now our input's a 1. And our output's a 0. And obviously that simple case is going to keep repeating, but feedback is our output becomes our next input. We'll need that tool in order to create memory. So before we get to the diagram, I'm going to go ahead and throw up some labels and terminology. That way when we label the picture in a moment, we'll know what the labels are. So at any given point in time, obviously we have our stored bit. And I'm going to use the standard notation of a cube to refer to that. And obviously that's an arbitrary symbol. In particular instances where we know what our memory is doing, we'd probably put better labels than Q. Q is just our standard generic one. And to keep that in there, we're going to use feedback. Which will always be the complement of Q. Which I'm going to use this notation, a bar over top of it. And that's complement with all E's, no I's. We're not saying something nice about our stored bit. Such as, like on a Venn diagram, we have set A and set B, so, and then some other stuff outside here. So the complement of A would be everything that's not in A. Whether it's in B or outside here, the complement of A is everything that is not in A, which is really easy in binary, because in binary we only have two things. We have a 1 and a 0, so the complement's the other one. Right? If we're storing a 1, our feedback has a 0 to keep that 1 there. And if we're storing a 0, our feedback has a 1 to keep that 0 there. So just a couple of terms, and that leads directly into the technical term for this piece, which never gets used, by the way. It's a bistable multi-vibrator. So vibration is controlled oscillation. Oscillation going back and forth. When we control it, we call it vibration. Multi-vibrator because we can access both of them. And bistable because it's stable. It holds a cube and it holds the not cube. Those are they're stable. They're stable inside the piece, and we can access them whenever we want to. So that's the technical term. For some classes, not our class, that's going to be an option on the multiple choice quiz, but nobody uses that because that's a mouthful. Bistable multi-vibrator is the technical term for a bit of memory. What we're going to say is flip-flop or latch. And those are generic, regularly used terms. They're interchangeable, though there is a tendency that if we're talking about the refined versions, where we take the basic one, like we're going to talk about today, and add in, kind of make it a little bit better, add in a clock signal and a few things to refine it, then we say flip-flop. If we're talking about the simplest case, then we say latch. But those are the terms we'll use, and whichever one, that's a bit of memory, a flip-flop or a latch. So we can flip-flop between them, or latch them in place, lock them in place. So that's the terms that get used, and bistable multi-vibrator is the technical term for a bit of memory. And now how this piece works. Obviously, there's more than one way to do this. So for the example, I'm going to go over a NAND gate latch. NAND gate latch. And we use that a lot in programming, electrical stuff. NAND means not and. So when we're programming, we say not and, and, I'll do our truth table real quick, just a quick refresh on what not and means, what NAND is. An AND gate means they're inclusive. So our inputs could either be off or on, on, there's all our combinations. So AND is inclusive. So if from our inputs, the only way we get an on the output is if both inputs are on. Anything else will be off. And I'll put this in red for the not. So if we add a not there, we're switching everything. So I should put the not here. So if it's not the and, then if they're both off, our and would give us a 0, and the not of that is a 1. Same thing here, and then that on output becomes an off. So with not and, the only way we get off is if both inputs are on. So we just take an AND gate and negate it. And I'm so in the habit of writing the symbols, I probably should have wrote not and then we just combine them, right? To get the word NAND. Because it's a little easier, it's not difficult to say, it flows right off the tongue. So we're going to use a not and latch. And the way this works is we'll have 2 of them. We need 2 of them to keep things around. So our symbol for not and, we have an and symbol. And then we add a little dot to indicate that it's not. And we'll need 2 of those in order to keep a bit present. So this first one, that's going to give our Q, which is our score bit. And the second one will give our not Q, which is the complement of our score bit. And so really we could use either one. Depending on how you want to wire up your circuit, you could use this, you could use the inverted output, in which case this provides the feedback. Or the way I'm going to talk about it is we're going to use the regular one as our stored input, which means this provides the feedback. So it's and, so we need 2 inputs coming in. Set and reset are the common terms for them. And they essentially do, they'll essentially do the same thing depending on which output we're using as our official output. I'm going to talk about this in there. So set is where we send in the bit we want to store. But we could swap this around and use this is our regular output and this is the feedback. And in that case, reset would give us the bit we want to store. But I'm going to say the set will send in the bit we want to store. So here's the output for it. And the not Q is the feedback controlling it. So our set, we store the bit, and then we'll send the feedback from that into the other NAND gate. At which point the output from that is going to feed back in here. I'm going to draw a little arch there to show it's jumping over those wires. They're not connected there in the middle. The output of the feedback comes into our first NAND gate and goes with that. And that's the wiring. So let's kind of trace this through and see what's going, trace through some bits to see this working. So, tracing some bits through here. First thing I'm going to do is rewrite that truth table over here so we can refer to it and keep track of what's going on. So we have, it's a 2 input logic gate, so we'll need 2 inputs and an output. Then our inputs, the only choices we have is off or on. So off, on. So there's all the combinations we can have. And it's not and. So not and, oh, if it was and, the only way we could get on is if both inputs are on. But when we negate that, the only way we get off is if both inputs are on. So if both inputs are on, our output is off. Everything else has the output on. Oops. Everything else has the output on, and if both inputs are on, our output is off. So there's a whole lot of negation going on here. We're switching things. There's knots everywhere. And one of the key things is if we want to store a 0, we send in a 1. If we want to store a 1, we send in a 0. So to simplify this picture, I'm going to put our actual input over here and run it through an inverter. That way, when I write send in a 0, store a 0, we send in a 0 to store a 0. I'm just adding this extra little picture. We send in the opposite of what we want to store. Excuse me. So let's start with storing a 1. So first off, I'm going to use Q as the stored bit and not Q as the feedback. So I'm not going to use this pin at all. I'm not going to use the reset pin. So I'm just going to send in a 1 and keep that a 1. That's not going to change from being a 1. So first off, let's store a 0. Store 0. So we send in a 0. That gets inverted so that our set pin has a 1 on it. And this involves feedback, so I kind of have to go a little out of order. But basically that means we're storing a 0. So we're going to store a 0. That's what I sent in over here. So we're storing a 0. So that feeds back into this gate. What's that little mark from? That feeds back into this NAND gate, which always has a 1 on it. So 1 not and 0, 1 not and 0, the output's going to be a 1. Which then that feeds back in here, and now the NAND gate that corresponds to the bit we're storing has 2 1s on it, which means the output's going to be a 0. So sorry about having to jump out of order a little bit there, but it's necessary when we're going through the feedback. So we can see if we send in a 0, want to store a 0, we get a 0 on our stored line. And I'll switch up colors here. Hopefully it shows up on the video okay. The other alternative is if we want to store a 1. So I'll send in a 1 to store. So when it gets inverted, so when the set pin goes to a 0, and again, there's a whole lot of negation, so the stored is the other. So we're storing a 1. Feedback from that goes down here. Well, this was always tied high, so now we have 1 not and 1, which means we have a 0 on our not stored bit. The feedback from that comes up here, and we have 0, 0 going into the not and bit that corresponds to the stored bit. The not and gate that corresponds to the stored bit. 0, 0, from our truth table, we can see 0, 0 gives a 1. And that's all our options, right? A binary state machine, so we can only have it on or off, and whichever one we send in, it's going to stay there until we change it. And that's how memory works in a computer, and that's the big one that separates computers from the rest of our machines, is they remember stuff. So we don't have to have that picture like I drew earlier where we send in an input and that immediately results in an output. And that output comes in real time from that input. As soon as we change the input, our output changes. We have memory. Our input can just go in here and just stick around until we're ready to use it. And then when we're ready to use it, then we check, then we pull from this instead of feeding the input straight to the output. So, like typical for these videos, let's put an example together, but one quick note to make before we actually plug up the wires. Okay, so just a quick note here about something you're probably already well aware of. So here's our chip for today, a Texas Instruments 74HC00. And that has 4 NAND gates. So we need 2 to make a latch, so that chip will work great for an example of a latch. And that's how we pick our chip size, because the point I wanted to make here, so here is a chip that has 3 latches. So it has 3 of this whole thing. And it's the same size as the chip I'm going to use today. Or here's one, again, the same size, 7 pins down each side, that has 2 flip-flops and something else. And generally, we use the term latch and flip-flop. They're generic terms, so they're kind of interchangeable, but there's a tendency to use flip-flop for the stepped-up example. So in the case of that chip I just showed, it's a super basic one that has a latch, but then we tie in a clock signal so that we can synchronize several latches together. There are other refinements we can make. In the refined versions, we tend to say flip-flop, and the basic versions we tend to say latch. But the same size as the one we're going to use, and obviously a lot more functionality. And to express the point even further, I didn't have one handy, so I just pulled up some pictures on my phone. So the first one there, 64 bits, has 64 bits, so 64 latches in a chip that's the same size, or right next to it, so you don't have to count the pins. These have 7 pins down each side. That bigger one there has 14 down the side, so twice the size, and you can see 256,000, 256K. So it's as big as 2 of these put together. Twice the size of this super basic gate I'm using, and it has 256,000 latches. So the size is kind of standard for integrated circuits. And then we pick the one, it's sized to be something we can work with our hands, and we pick the one that has the functionality we need. Obviously, I'm using one of the most simplest case things to build this latch, but obviously we can fit a whole lot more functionality onto a chip the exact same size. You're probably already well aware of that. I just wanted to express it at least once somewhere on this playlist of videos with the pieces in my hand to express the point. So now let's look at, I'll go put the example together, and then with Texas Instruments 74HC00 chip, and then we'll look at that. Okay, so here's that tied up in an example. So chip's electrical piece, so it needs power and ground. That's the red and white wire here. Then here is the bit we're going to store. Send in the bit we want to store. And over here is the reset bit, the reset line. Then I used a couple diodes, which are essentially one-way valves for the electricity, so they can only flow one way. So this diode takes the output of the first NAND gate and sends it over as an input for the second NAND gate, which is tied in with the reset line. And then this next diode takes the output of the second NAND gate and brings that back over as an input for the first NAND gate. So if I plug these up, I'll run the reset high, and
I guess first off I store a 0, which remember it inverts it, so to store a 0, I'll send a high signal. I'll plug this into the positive rail. So I plug that in. You can see we have a 1 going to the light. So the green light is Q and the red light is not Q, is how I wired this up. So now if I want to, oh, I need to reset that. So there, when I flash the reset pin, now it stores whatever's on that line. So I send in a high signal, which means I sent in a 1, so it's storing a 0. So we can see Q is off and not Q is on. And switch this over, plug that in the 0 line, flash the reset pin back to a 1, and now you can see it inverts what's being sent in. So sending in a 0, it stores a 1, so Q is on and not Q is off. And that's all there is to a bit of memory. It's in another video. I've been trying not to refer to them, but just to express the point, in another video in the playlist, I showed that it takes where's a good spot to put my hand? It takes 2 switches to make an AND gate, and then with a third switch, we can short that back to ground, and make a not AND gate. So 3 switches for a not AND gate. Combine 2 of those gates up, so 6 switches is all we need to store a bit of memory. So let's go back over the board and wrap this up.
So hopefully that cleared up some of the mystery about what memory is. That's the thing that sets computers apart from the rest of our machines. What really makes all this possible is the memory. You can see it's not some magical piece too complicated to understand, right? We just combine a couple switches together into a NAND gate, and then we combine a couple NAND gates together into a latch. And then that gives us a bit of memory. So then that simple picture that I drew earlier, where our real-time input feeds into the device to give real-time output, we can modify it a little bit by putting some memory in there. So now our input can just stick around until we're ready for it. And we can send that input in and then do a bunch of other stuff while the computer remembers that input, and when we're ready for it, then we can use it later for our output. But just a way to combine switches. We put a couple switches together to create NAND gates, then we put a couple NAND gates together to create a latch. And that's what memory is. So hopefully that pulled some of the mystery out of that piece.